June 28, 1997, an 83-year-old woman named Leila Howard turned up the radio in the living room of her small home in Texas, and then she took a seat next to her husband, Raymond, on the couch. This was a song that both of them loved, and in the past, Leila knew her husband would have swooped her up and begun dancing with her right away. But Raymond was now 88 years old, he was also recovering from brain surgery, and they both were planning to go to bed in the next few minutes because they had a big day the next day. They were going to go to the Pioneer Day Music Festival, which is an annual fiddling festival located about 15 miles away from where Leila and Raymond lived, in the town of Salado, Texas. Leila and Raymond attended this festival basically every year. Leila's son Hal had tried to persuade Leila to let him drive the couple to the music festival, but Leila said no because Leila and Raymond were both fiercely independent and wanted to be in control of their lives. Also, Leila had talked about maybe going someplace else after the festival ended with Raymond, kind of spontaneously just driving out and doing something. The next morning, so June 29th, Leila and Raymond walked out the front door of their house and they walked down to their driveway where their Oldsmobile car was parked. Leila helped Raymond get into the passenger seat, and then Leila took her spot in the driver's seat. And then a few moments later, after they were all buckled in and situated, Leila fired up the car, backed out the driveway, and began driving. That evening, Leila's son, Hal, decided to swing by Leila and Raymond's house to check in on them and see how the festival went. And so at about 5 p.m., Hal got to their house, and right away when he pulled up, he noticed that Leila and Raymond's car, the Oldsmobile, was not in the driveway. And so Hal thought that was pretty odd because by now they should have been back from the festival. In years past, they would always get home by about 3 p.m. at the absolute latest. And so he thought, maybe his mom and Raymond were out driving around somewhere and they'd be back later. But just for good measure, Hal did park the car and he walked up to the front door of the house and he did knock. But when there was no answer, he thought, you know what, I'll just go home and come back in a few hours and check in on them at that point. And so, a few hours later, at 8 p.m., Hal drove back to Leila and Raymond's house, and when he got there, he saw their car was still not back yet. And so now Hal's starting to feel pretty worried, and so he parked the car, he walked up to the front door, he did knock, there was no answer, and so he pulled out his set of keys, he opened up the door, and he walked inside. Now, as soon as he was in the house, nothing looked out of place, but as he walked around looking for some sign of where Leila and Raymond were, all he could find was on one of the beds there were all these neat stacks of clothes that were laid out as if somebody was getting ready to pack but didn't finish packing. And so it just seemed like something's off here. Something must have happened at the festival. That's why they're not back yet. And so kind of in a panic, Hal ran outside and he called the police. And after reporting Leila and Raymond missing, he actually began calling news stations and telling them, can you please put out my mom and Raymond's picture because they're older and they're missing, I need your help. And in fact, that night, those TV stations did begin putting out all these reports about how Leila and Raymond were missing and for people to be on the lookout for them and their car. At the same time, the police immediately launched an investigation, and they quickly discovered that Leila and Raymond had never even made it to the music festival. And the police would send out all these missing person reports to police officers all over the state of Texas, and nobody reported seeing anything or hearing anything. That is, until 3 days later on July 2nd. On that night, a police officer in a little town in Arkansas, located 500 miles away from where Leila and Raymond lived, was driving down the road when he spotted an Oldsmobile that was driving with its lights off. And so the officer pulled the car over and he ran the license plate and it came back as belonging to Leila and Raymond. But you gotta remember, all those TV broadcasts and all the missing person alerts that were getting sent out all over the place, those were really only happening in the state of Texas. And so this officer has no clue that Leila and Raymond are missing. But he runs the plate, he sees it belongs to Leila and Raymond, and he goes up to the driver's side window, and he looks inside, and he sees Leila and Raymond. And they look like a really happy older couple. And the officer would say to Leila, hey, you're driving with your lights off. And Leila would say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. We were driving in Texas, and we got lost, and I just didn't notice. I'm really sorry. The officer believed her and felt like these were good people who just made an honest mistake, and so he just flicked her lights on and said, I'm going to give you a warning, no big deal, no ticket, but be careful with your lights. And then actually the officer gave Leila directions on how to get back to Texas from Arkansas, and then he got back in his cruiser, and then he watched as Leila and Raymond pulled onto the main road and then disappeared into the darkness. The police officer in Arkansas who pulled them over would eventually put it together who he had pulled over, and at that point, Arkansas would get in on the search for Lela and Raymond. But for the next 2 weeks, despite having both states aggressively searching for this couple, nobody could find them. That is until July 12th, so that's 10 days after Lela and Raymond got pulled over by that cop in Arkansas. On that day, these two young boys were walking by a small stream in a town called Hot Springs, Arkansas, when they began to smell a terrible smell. They would end up telling their parents, who would come back to the stream and they'd smell it too, and they would end up alerting the police, and the police would come out and they would search that entire area, and they would find Lela and Raymond's Oldsmobile at the base of a 25-foot cliff, and inside the vehicle were Lela and Raymond, and they were both deceased. It looked very much like Lela and Raymond had driven off this cliff and they had landed down below, and that's what killed them. But when investigators went up to the top of that cliff, there were no skid marks on the cliff itself, which meant Lela, who was driving, never hit the brakes as she went over the cliff. Nobody knows why Lela and Raymond abruptly left their town and drove hundreds of miles into Arkansas instead of going to their favorite music festival, although their family members have speculated that it could be because Lela and Raymond had declining cognitive function, and so they basically didn't know what was going on, and that's why it happened. But the reason this story is in this video is because this story about Lela and Raymond is what inspired a very, very famous song from the late 1990s. It's called The Way by Fastball. If you know the song, now you know it's got a pretty intense backstory.